Mabuhay! Welcome to Lagim, a Filipino True Crime Podcast. My name is Christine, and this is episode 14 on the PhilSports Stadium Stampede, better known as the Wowowee Stampede. As always, make sure to follow Lagim on all its socials. We are on Instagram at Lagim Podcast, on Twitter at Lagim Pod, on TikTok at Lagim Podcast, and on Facebook. Just search for Lagim, a Filipino True Crime Podcast, and find both our fan page and our discussion group there. Lagim is also officially on YouTube now, so you can stream all the past episodes and this one right now on YouTube. Content warning. This episode contains details that could be upsetting and disturbing to some people, so make sure that you take care of yourself whilst listening. Having been in this pandemic for what it feels like 20 years, I almost forgot that we used to go to big gatherings such as concerts, conferences, parties at the club, networking events, and just plain old family gatherings. So, when I was researching this case, it was interesting to see that apart from the horrible tragedy that so obviously made this an international headline, I was also looking at it with pandemic lenses and I became worried about things like infection rates and social distancing. Whether we will ever go back to a point where big gatherings will be a thing again is a question that only time can answer. But what I do know is that whether there's a pandemic or not, organizers of events assume a big role and carry with them an immense responsibility and duty of care in making sure that the lives of people are kept safe. If this is not understood and taken seriously, people pay for it with their lives. And this is exactly what happened on the 4th of February 2006 at the PhilSports Stadium in Pasig. Noontime variety shows are nothing new to Filipino culture. We all grew up watching Eat Bulaga, and despite my feelings towards the main hosts, please check my Pepsi Paloma episode to know all about that, the show has become a lunch staple almost for most Filipinos. As a society, we love to be entertained. We love some dancing. We love the regular puns sneaked into the host's dialogue. We love the celebrity guests. And we love the contests where ordinary people can win money, things, and even vacations. Since Eat Bulaga's migration from ABS-CBN to the GMA network in 1995, ABS-CBN had been wanting to compete with the show, and it would take them at least 10 years to find the right formula, concept, and the right person to host a rival noon show. In comes Willie Revillame. Much can be said about Revillame, who lists himself as an actor, comedian, host, businessman, singer, and songwriter, amongst other things. Like him or not, he managed to finally help launch a noontime variety show at ABS-CBN that made a worthy contender for Eat Bulaga. And so, Wowowee was born. The show took the old noontime variety show recipe and put it on semi steroids. Even as a young 20 something back then, it was clear to me that the show banked on not only our love for noontime shows as a sort of lunchtime companion and the Filipinos' love for celebrity culture, but also, and sadly, the impoverished state of most of our fellow Filipinos in the Philippines. I promise I will get into this aspect much later in the episode. Anyway, Wowowee used money and cash prizes to lure in its audience. The show had multiple segments that were essentially money contests. Anybody remember Pera o Bayong or Wheel of Fortune and perhaps Hep Hep Hooray with its catchy jingle? The promise of money on top of Willie's brand of humor drew people in quickly and in droves. According to the TNS national TV ratings, the show consistently hit the 20% mark and reached 30% during special episodes. Wowowee hit gold, and it was on a roll. So, After a year of being at the height of success, it was time to celebrate its first year anniversary. It had to be bigger, better, and there had to be more cash and other prizes involved than usual. In the run up to the event, the show announced prizes that promised instant prosperity, livelihood packages such as a house and lot, jeepneys, tricycles, and taxis, and a 2 million pesos cash prize. This was played up over and over again in the weeks and days before the 4th of February, with Willie Revillame even saying that walang uuwi na luhaan, or in English, no one will go home in tears, comparing the upcoming anniversary show to Christmas. The nation was pumped and ready to go, and in the minds of the show's organizers, I think, they thought nothing could go wrong. Now, what I need to tell you from the get go here is that after the tragedy at PhilSports Stadium, a task force called Task Force Ultra was established by the Department of Interior and Local Government. They were ordered by then President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo to investigate the events of that fateful day and to investigate it thoroughly. And it is the results of this investigation, plus my own research, that I want to use here in telling the story of what happened on the 4th of February. As I could not find a public copy of the investigation report that was published on the 7th of February 2006, I heavily relied on an excellent article published by PhilRights, a human rights organization who publishes regular articles on their website. That article also filled in a lot of the knowledge gaps I had when it came to the details in this case, details that were not necessarily widely published in the aftermath of the Stampede. So do read it when you get time. The link to the article is in the sources list. Now back to the events before the Stampede. According to the Phil Rights article, most of the local residents had witnessed how people had started arriving at the PhilSports Stadium, locally also known as Ultra, 4 or even 5 days before the Wowowee anniversary show. In my own research, I found an account by one local resident who gave a very jarring insight into what was happening on the ground days before the tragedy. The local resident named Louis Montalvo, who was at the time a professor at the Ateneo Graduate School of Business, shared that he saw how the crowd of people swelled up over the days. He recalled that as early as Wednesday night, that is February 1st, people were already beginning to mass up outside the gates of Ultra, with other witnesses saying that people had actually started camping outside of the gates as early as the 30th of January. Montalvo further noted that the lines that were formed during those days began to, and I quote here, spill over the roads such that those entering the village where I lived could not bring in their vehicles and were forced to walk. End of quote. Montalvo further added that he, and I quote again, assessed that unless something is done, people will get hurt. End of quote. Montalvo also recounted how a friend of his described the crowd at Ultra as looking like victims of fire. According to the friend, the people looked so desolate and desperate. Apparently, there was a swarm of elderly women, children, and mothers carrying babies who all slept on pavements whilst enduring the cold nightly temperatures. It was clear to both Montalvo and his friend that the people gathered outside the stadium had little food and were forced to use the obviously inadequate toilet facilities on site. Now, let us focus on the timeline of events on the 4th of February 2006. According to the findings of the DILG, at 4 o'clock in the morning, security guards announced to the eagerly waiting crowds that the gate to the arena would be opened in 2 hours at 6 o'clock. The guards also announced that not everyone would be let in, And this, I can imagine, would have triggered the already tired, agitated, and excited crowd. At this point, it was estimated that 25,000 to 35,000 people had already gathered outside the gate of the stadium. Some reports even stated they estimated 50,000 people. Now, bear in mind that the stadium is only built to hold 19,000 people. It has to be noted here that the football stadium was supposed to serve as a viewing area for those people who could not get into the basketball arena where the show was actually going to be staged. Both the stadium and the arena were part of the same complex. 2 hours later, at 6 o'clock, then associate producer Mel Feliciano announced that only the first 300 people in line would be given tickets, which would enable them, if selected, to join the Pera o Bayong contest. This would give any contestant a chance to win prizes from 10,000 to 50,000 pesos. This announcement, in retrospect, can now be seen as the catalyst of the Stampede, as this, I can also imagine, may have acted as the last straw on the proverbial camel's back. When people had been told for weeks and days that no one would go home in tears and that the event would be like Christmas in February, it does not take a lot to drive people to act in a way that can be compared to going into survival mode. According to the DILG report, Feliciano's announcement incited the people who found themselves outside of the official 300 only line to push their way into the already jam packed line in front of them, in the hope they could become one of the first 300 people. This caused the network staff to panic and then close the gates in an attempt to gain some control over the waves of people wanting to get in at that moment. In some accounts, some witnesses said that someone had screamed something about a bomb, but I do not think that that line of inquiry was pursued, as this was not deemed as the catalyst for the stampede. So, what happened next? The people kept pushing their way to the front, wanting to get to the gate to get their tickets. The sheer force coming from the masses putting their weight against the gate eventually made it give way. It flung open with such speed and force that the people directly behind it stumbled, fell, and piled on one another so quickly that those nearest to the gate were immediately finding themselves crushed by several people at once. What made the situation even worse was that there was a steep decline from the gate onwards, and the surface of that road, normally meant for vehicular use only, was rather uneven. This meant that when one person stumbled, others fell like dominoes on top of one another. There was only one inevitable outcome: a stampede that would claim 74 lives and injure at least 600 more. Some reports even claimed that there were 800 injured people in the aftermath of the Wowowee stampede. I tried to put my mind in that situation, and I think even my imagination cannot truly fathom the heat, pressure, the fear, hunger, thirst, and eventual claustrophobia from being in the midst of a stampede. It must have been horrifying to realize that one was essentially caught in the middle of this melee without any chance of getting out alive or unscathed. One witness recounted that she and others were pressed against the gate of the stadium as people fell on top of one another. She said she lost consciousness, and when she came to, she was pinned underneath several people. The witness further described, and I quote, "Under me was a dead person. Beside me there was another dead, and there was another dead above me." End of quote. The scene after the stampede was sobering. NBC News described in its report the following, and I quote, "Bags and shoes littered the scene. Authorities lined up the bodies outside the stadium for identification. Officials put digital photographs of unidentified bodies on windows. End of quote. When I read these accounts, these vivid descriptions of the aftermath, I keep going back to the fact that there were children in the midst of these crushing forces. Of those who died, 68 were women, one of them was pregnant. The youngest fatality was 4 years old, the oldest was 81. The majority of those who were crushed to death were over the age of 50. Now, it would not take a genius to guess that the first people, apart from those who were being crushed in the stampede, who would learn about the stampede itself were the organizers and the venue. After all, the producer and other staff members and guards from both the stadium and ABS-CBN were present during the stampede. You would think that ABS-CBN, being a news network as well, would report about the tragedy ASAP. However, the DILG report would reveal that, in fact, ABS-CBN waited a couple of hours before announcing to the world that something horrible had happened at Ultra. Normally, a news network would scram to be the first one to cover any major event, but this time ABS-CBN sat on their hands, which proved to be fatal for the people at the Stampede. Furthermore, Undersecretary Marius Corpus, who was heading Task Force Ultra, revealed that instead of calling emergency services such as ambulances or the police perhaps, the staff of Wowowee contacted ABS-CBN management, costing the emergency services precious time that could have saved lives. ABS-CBN was, it appears to me, more concerned about the PR disaster coming their way than about the dying people outside the gates of Ultra. So, as the world slowly woke up to the horrible scenes at Ultra, and as morgues were filled with corpses, and as hospitals were beginning to become overcrowded by injured citizens, ABS-CBN started their damage control of their reputation. They offered to cover the funeral expenses of the families with loved ones who died, and they also promised to cover the hospital bills of those who were being treated in the aftermath of the stampede, all the while denying responsibility. As I already mentioned, then President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo also ordered the DILG to start an investigation ASAP. So, whilst this was all happening, bear in mind that the show, Wowowee, still had not been cancelled. Willie Revillame was quoted at some point to have said that the show must go on, if only to provide information for the families of the injured and those who died. I can hardly accept this as a reason to keep the show going. It seemed cruel and tone deaf. In the end, the police involved said that the show definitely could not go on, and that an investigation into the stampede needed to start immediately. The announcement about the show's cancellation came through at noontime, a mere hour before the show's original airtime at 1 o'clock. The next day, the nation grieved with the families of the stampede victims. Fellow Filipinos who were able to visit Ultra laid down flowers and lit candles on the road where the day before, dead bodies were lined up amidst their personal belongings. Onlookers prayed and janitors hosed down the area with water. As for the local and national government authorities, there was no time to stop and grieve. There was much work to do. It would come to no one's surprise that in their investigation, the DILG had choice words for ABS-CBN and how they dealt with the events before, during, and after the tragic stampede. Undersecretary Marius Corpus stated that the tragedy was in reality preventable and predictable. The task force was unequivocal in its findings that the TV network was ultimately responsible for the tragedy, specifically pointing out the obvious lack of contingency plans for an event where tens of thousands were expected. The DILG stated that lacking such a plan, and I quote, borders on irresponsible and incompetent management, at best to criminal negligence and endangerment leading to the loss of life at worst, end of quote. Mind you, when I say these findings should not come as a surprise, they really should not. Studies and best practices for crowd management and crowd control have been around for ages, and there really should not be any excuse not to properly manage such an event. An interesting article cited by a few reports I have come across in my research pointed out over and over again how simple crowd management could have stopped this tragedy from happening. The article is from John J. Froon, who originally presented the contents of the article in a conference back in 1993. The title of his presentation and article is The Causes and Prevention of Crowd Disasters. Even in 2005, his assessment of crowd disasters and recommendations still very much have relevance. I made sure to include a link of this article in the sources list as well. Using Froon's terminology, what happened at Ultra was a mass craze that arose from a competitive rush to obtain something that is perceived as being high valued, in this case, money and other prices. In general, this could be an event or a person or a privileged seat in a venue. This perception is a result of a lot of combined things, I would argue, but Froon emphasizes that the perception of something high valued is formed largely because of intensive promotion, or in TV terms, advertisements, of which Wowowee had plenty days and weeks before the Stampede. Nevertheless, Froon asserts, and I quote, most major crowd disasters can be prevented by simple crowd management strategies. The primary crowd management objectives are the avoidance of critical crowd densities and the triggering of rapid group movement. End of quote. And none of that was achieved by Wawawee's organizers. Now, let's dip back into the task force's findings. Task Force Ultra further stated in their investigation that there was also an obvious lack of coordination between the security guards by the ABS-CBN TV network, the security guards working for PhilSports, and the local police. The DILG further recommended that the TV network executives and organizers should be held accountable. The DILG said that the crowd at Ultra was, and I quote, exploited, manipulated, and treated like animals, end of quote. They further said, and I quote again, the decision or act of offering so few tickets to so many people can be likened to throwing a small slice of meat to a hungry pack of wolves, and this triggered the stampede, end of quote. As a response, the ABS-CBN network metaphorically shook their fists in the air in indignation, accusing the DILG of including several inaccuracies in their report. The network called for an independent investigation. Furthermore, the eyes of the public also turned to the local police force and even the Pasig City Mayor's office, as they are the local government authorities who should have held ABS-CBN to account from the very beginning. Don't worry, there will be a few things to be said about that later on. Now, remember when I told you that ABS-CBN offered to pay for funeral and hospital costs of the victims and their families? As it turned out, the families were offered this assistance in exchange for their signatures on waivers that essentially said that the families would never file legal action against the network as an exchange for the financial assistance. ABS-CBN was, it seems to me, buying their silence. However, ABS-CBN had other things coming to them. Separate from the DILG's investigation, the National Bureau of Investigation, or NBI, had also started their own criminal investigation into the matter. The NBI concluded their investigation about a month after the Stampede. First and foremost, they made a recommendation for the DOJ, the Department of Justice, to file criminal charges against 17 individuals, 12 of whom were officers and employees of ABS-CBN, including Willie Revillame. The other 5 were officials of the PhilSports Stadium. In their report's conclusion, the NBI found that several network executives, led by then Executive Vice President Charo Santos Concho, were liable for reckless imprudence resulting in multiple homicide and multiple injuries. The NBI also felt that administrative charges should be filed against then Pasig City Mayor Vicente Eusebio for his failure to require the TV network to submit a proper security plan before issuing a permit. What struck me, however, was this part. The NBI was of the opinion that the mayor should have asked ABS-CBN to submit a crowd control plan before granting the permit. In a letter from ABS-CBN to Mayor Eusebio dated 17th of January 2006, the show's organizers asked Pasig City government for police help, saying they expected an audience turnout beyond the capacity of the show's venue, and noting that a stampede was possible. So, the show knew all along, expected this all along, and still went ahead, it seems. Another government entity that was investigated by the NBI but ultimately absolved was the Metro Manila Development Authority, or MMDA, which is responsible for keeping cleanliness and order in public spaces. Now, that was only a rough overview of what the NBI had to say in their investigation. And you would think that the NBI's report was able to provide some sort of feeling of vindication for the families of the victims. But one thing that was glaringly obvious was that the bigger players of the organizations involved remained unscathed and unnamed in this report. For example, then ABS-CBN Chair and CEO Eugenio Lopez III and then Pasig Police Chief Raul Medina were not named amongst the culprits, and this was very frustrating for the victims and their families. Now, weirdly enough, despite that, ABS-CBN was not happy with the NBI investigation results either. In a response statement, the TV network stated the following, and I quote, "We deplore the manner by which the NBI has arrived at its conclusions and recommendations in seeking to charge ABS-CBN officials and employees perceived to be liable without factual or legal basis, as well as whitewashing the clear liabilities of others responsible." End of quote. The TV network stated it would cooperate with any preliminary investigation if standard legal procedure is used. It then further stated, and I quote again, "We are concerned, however, regarding the selective manner in which the NBI conducted their investigation, particularly in not charging members of the Philippine National Police and overlooking and disregarding their negligence and culpabilities by not performing their duties under the law. The DOJ and not the NBI should be the proper authority to decide in its preliminary investigation." End of quote. So, it would seem that ABS-CBN was not happy with the DILG report as well as the NBI report. And seeing that ABS-CBN will unlikely cooperate with the NBI any further, who they deemed as not the right authority to conduct any investigation into the Stampede, the Department of Justice finally stepped in and started conducting their own investigation to specifically determine probable cause of criminal negligence. Now, you would think that ABS-CBN would finally cooperate and be pleased by the DOJ's involvement, but it was not. It was surprising that when the DOJ did start their investigation, the TV network also did not seem to like this. They accused the DOJ of institutional bias and even went so far as making a petition with the Court of Appeals saying that surely the DOJ cannot be impartial as they have already prejudged the case, a seemingly very different opinion from what they expressed earlier when the NBI was still investigating the case. Surprisingly, the court put a restraining order on the DOJ's investigation that lasted around 8 weeks. By May of 2006, the investigation was allowed to finally proceed. Now, remember that whilst the DOJ and ABS-CBN were fighting it out in the Court of Appeals, the NBI was observing everything in the background and quickly realized that ABS-CBN's goal in delaying the DOJ's investigation was to essentially bide their time. They needed ample time to negotiate settlements with the victims. After all, a class action by the injured victims and the families of the dead victims could become imminent at this point. The Volunteers Against Crime and Corruption, an anti crime watchdog group, was gearing up to assist and support the victims in the filing of this class action. The group was of the very strong opinion that then ABS-CBN Chief Executive Eugenio Lopez III, as well as Mayor Eusebio, should be charged. But the TV network was diligent. It continued with their negotiations with the families, especially with the families of the initially believed 71 dead victims and over 900 injured victims. The final count of deaths was eventually confirmed as being 74, with some reports still insisting that it was only 73. Now, I cannot account for the differences in the number of injured victims. I know that in the beginning of this podcast, I've already said that there might have been 600 or 800, but from this source that I've used, it could be 900. So let's just stick with 900 for now. Now, whilst ABS-CBN was making sure they created enough of a diversion in order to negotiate settlements, it was also demonstrating a masterclass in public relations. They quickly set up the 71 Dreams Foundation, which, according to the TV network, will provide long term aid to not only the victims and families of the victims of the Stampede, but to other impoverished Kapwa Filipinos. And impoverished, really, is the operative word here. ABS-CBN knew that in talking to the victims and their families, they would have an enormous advantage because they were the ones with money. Most of the people who were at the Stampede that day, as I've already pointed out earlier, were poor and marginalized Filipinos who hoped for some luck and cash prizes. ABS-CBN knew that if they were successful in convincing the victims to settle, the criminal charges could potentially be dropped. Now, you may have noticed that so much had happened in such a short amount of time after the Stampede. Investigations were conducted one after the other. The DOJ and ABS were battling it out in court. ABS-CBN was trying hard to settle with the families. Filipinos were naturally outraged. There were outcries for the dead victims and also for the families of the injured victims. And of course, there was indignation from the Filipino society. However, by March, Wowowee was back on air, and ABS-CBN executives justified this by saying that the audience demanded it. A month later, the news outlets barely reported anything in relation to the Stampede. By June of 2006, it felt like a reset button had been used to make the people forget what happened at Ultra. It seemed like the slate had been wiped clean of whatever happened in February. The DOJ nevertheless soldiered on with their investigation, and ABS-CBN made sure to hire a top-tier lawyer to head its legal team. they managed to put a former undersecretary of the Department of Justice on their retainer. By October 2006, the class action I mentioned before was started by the Volunteers Against Crime and Corruption, or VACC, on behalf of the victims and families of the victims. As far as my research is concerned, the case was still ongoing by 2014. I do not have any new information as to the current status of the case. Founding chairman of the VACC, Dante Jimenez, stated the following in an article from 2014, and I quote, "While some relatives of the victims already were making settlements as regards the civil aspect of the case, the court hearing in relation to the criminal aspect is continuing." End of quote. As of 2014, the case was at the docket of Judge Florian Gregory Abalahon of the Pasig City Regional Trial Court Branch 261. The article indicated that there was a conscious effort on the part of the court to finish the case, but it also revealed that both parties in the case seemed to also stall the process by filing motion after motion. Now, as for ABS-CBN's fight against all the government entities investigating it, that is a different story that has a lot of twists and turns. So let's go back to 2006 and summarize a few things quickly, but also make a few things more clear as to how it all played out legally when ABS-CBN and the different government entities were battling it out. As you can remember, the DOJ soldiered on with their investigation whilst ABS-CBN was also hard at work trying to negotiate settlements with the victims and families of the victims who died. ABS-CBN had been steadfast in their opposition to the DOJ's investigation even after the initial restraining order. There is a court document that I will include in my sources list that highlights very well how the different investigations unfolded. First, there was the DILG Task Force investigation that I have already profusely covered in this episode. After the resulting report of that investigation was made public on the 7th of February, the DOJ then evaluated the report and wanted to determine the next day whether, and I quote, "there is sufficient basis to proceed with the conduct of a preliminary investigation on the basis of the documents submitted." End of quote. The documents again here were the report from the DILG. By the 20th of February, the DOJ then concluded that there was no basis for a preliminary investigation for 4 reasons. This is the first reason. There were no formal complaints that had been filed by any of the victims and or their relatives or any law enforcement agency after the Stampede. Secondly, whilst there was mention in the DILG's report that there were deaths and injuries, there were no documents submitted to prove this. Thirdly, the fact-finding report did not indicate the names of the persons involved and their specific participation in the quote-unquote Ultra incident. And lastly, most of the victims did not mention in their sworn statements the names of the persons whom they alleged to be responsible for the Stampede. Now, my lawyer brain understands that this is the DOJ being very nitpicky and perhaps trying to be by the book. But these reasons that they have given do not seem pragmatic, holistic, nor reasonable to me at all. If anything, they seem to be very obtuse. So, since the DOJ did not want to conduct a preliminary investigation, the NBI moved into the picture and submitted to the DOJ specifically a report on the 8th of March 2006. As you know, they recommended that certain people within the network needed to be charged with reckless imprudence resulting in multiple homicide and multiple physical injuries. The DOJ Having read the NBI's report and acting upon its recommendation, now wanted to act again and ended up putting together a designated panel of prosecutors to finally conduct a preliminary investigation. What a change of heart. This is when ABS-CBN moved to stop the DOJ's actions. By March 27th, ABS-CBN was granted the restraining order and the DOJ ceased any further investigation. The investigation resumed after the restraining order expired, and by October 2006, the DOJ investigation panel found probable cause to indict some bigwigs within ABS-CBN, including Charo Santos Concho, Socorro Vidanes, and Mel Feliciano, amongst others. These findings were made through a resolution that ABS-CBN had then sought to annul in the Supreme Court through a petition in 2008. They accused the DOJ of having prejudged the case already, amongst other things. In their petition, they cited, amongst other things, the behavior of DOJ Secretary Raul Gonzalez, who announced to the media that ABS-CBN was careless in its duty to keep an eye on the possible horrible scenarios that could happen in staging their anniversary event. Despite all this, ABS-CBN's petition was denied. In their 22-page decision, the Supreme Court on the 29th of January 2008, through Associate Justice Conchitina Carpio Morales, disagreed with ABS-CBN's allegations that the DOJ's preliminary investigation was biased and unfounded. The ruling directed the DOJ prosecutors to continue with the proceedings to determine if there was probable cause to charge ABS-CBN executive of reckless imprudence resulting in multiple homicide and multiple physical injuries. The Supreme Court's decision also denied the plea of ABS-CBN for another temporary restraining order against the DOJ panel's preliminary investigation. This would eventually pave the way for the indictment of all those involved in the Wowowee Stampede with criminal charges except for host Willie Revillame. It is amazing and terrifying to me in equal measures that ABS-CBN as a TV network managed to block these many investigatory efforts for 2 years, and that only after this time was the preliminary investigation allowed to proceed. Mind you, after the January 2008 decision, ABS-CBN tried their luck again in October of the same year, but the Supreme Court stood by their original decision from a few months earlier. Now, let me take a quick detour into Willie Revillame. Separate charges were brought against him in 2007 for reckless imprudence resulting in multiple homicide and physical injuries. He was cleared of charges then, but a motion for reconsideration was filed by petitioners who were likely the victims of the Stampede. I could not find a court document, so I am making an educated guess at this point. The motion was considered, but in 2010, Revillame was absolved of all charges as he was deemed to have no direct or indirect participation in the Stampede, being the show's host. And now back to the main case with ABS-CBN. Like I said before, it does not seem like there is anything new on the case, which really left me with a sick feeling in my stomach. It has been 15 years since the tragedy, and if indeed the court case involving the injured victims and the families of the ones who died at the Stampede is still ongoing, then justice has essentially already been denied. Justice delayed, as I always say and believe, is justice denied. Remember at this point that there are supposed to be 2 cases ongoing here, a criminal case against ABS-CBN and a civil case where the victims could potentially get awarded damages. Those who settled are unlikely to get any more damages, but they could nevertheless become witnesses in the criminal case. Earlier, when I said that the criminal case could potentially be weakened or even dropped if most of the families accept settlements from ABS-CBN, I simply meant to say that these families could choose to withdraw their cooperation in the criminal case, which could lead to the weakening of it. I wish I knew more, and I will make sure to keep you updated once new information comes in. So, whilst researching this case, I keep thinking about how the ABS-CBN execs and employees who are involved in the case are most probably enjoying their lives. Meanwhile, the poor victims remain poor. Admittedly, some families did settle, as I already said, and they chose to accept the network's money offers. But can you really blame them? The impoverished have always been the victim here from the very beginning, way before the Stampede. Now, do let me explain. Whilst we can point all our fingers at ABS-CBN, Willie Revillame, the police, and the local government unit all day, let us not forget that what happened at Ultra is ultimately a symptom of a much greater and graver problem that our national government should essentially be held accountable for, and that is poverty, abject poverty, financial and social insecurity, however you want to name it. It was what drove the people to Ultra days before the event in the hopes to alleviate their suffering. Back in 2006, it was said that around 30% of Filipinos lived under the poverty line. The reports I have seen cited used the World Bank as their source, but I could not verify this. However, what I can verify is that currently 16.6% of Filipinos live under the poverty line, and this has been seen as an improvement from higher numbers in the past, so maybe the 30% was not too far fetched at all. This is the starting point of the problem. Those who hover just above the poverty line do not live that much of a comfortable life either. In 2006, it was said that around 40% of Filipinos lived on around $2 a day. $2. I surmise that things have not changed that drastically. On average, Filipinos earn $6 a day. Again, that is not a lot. It should therefore not come as a surprise yet again that when you are promised 2 million pesos, jeepneys, taxis, tricycles, or a house and lot by a popular noontime variety show, you see a possible out from your current dire situation. You are driven to take the risk of traveling from your home to Pasig to stay and sleep near the arena days before the event in the hope that you get to have the luck of winning anything, just anything from the show. The only culprit that remained sort of safe and semi unscathed from all the investigations was the national government itself. I think it goes without saying that the way the country has been run for these past decades, regardless of who sits in Malacanang, has driven people to more extreme ways to get out of their impoverished status. When the state fails to provide, secure, and care for its citizens, the citizens suffer and are left to their own devices. And ABS-CBN took full advantage of this very real reality in our Filipino society. ABS-CBN and Willie Revillame have always maintained that they wanted to help the poor, that they wanted to assist the government in alleviating poverty in the nation, going so far as to say that they were performing a public service. But really, we are talking about a business venture here who found a way to capitalize on poverty, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Let me explain. When Wowowee was first aired in 2005, 18.8% of households in Metro Manila, Rizal, and parts of Cavite, Laguna, and Bulacan were tuned in to the show. From February 5th to December 31st of 2005, further data showed that Wowowee's average number of viewers per minute of airing was around 620,000 households. 26% of those households were from the skilled working class, and 62% belonged to the semi skilled and unskilled working class, as well as those considered residual and those at the lowest levels of subsistence. 88%, therefore, of the show's viewers were at the time from the working class who were attracted to the prizes offered by the show. The show ultimately catered to those who were poor, and ratings very quickly shot up as a result. This was Wowowee's winning recipe, and it helped the show become so successful in its first year and the years afterwards, even after the Stampede. Furthermore, in an article by the French press agency, Revillame stated that he would pick places where poverty hit the hardest and stage shows there all throughout the year. He said, and I quote, "This is a program that intends to help Filipinos, especially the poor." End of quote. However, in reality, and as so astutely pointed out by an article by the World Socialist website, the show was, and I quote again, based on the exploitation of the emotional responses of impoverished people, where chances of winning a prize are minuscule. End of quote. So, whilst Willie Revillame, and to some extent perhaps ABS-CBN, might have thought that what he was or they were doing was noble, it might have really appeared noble on the surface. But please do remember that ultimately, this was all done for ratings and sponsorships. Altruism hardly has a place in business. After researching this case, it did make it glaringly obvious to me that the poor in our society can never win. What bothered me, as I already indicated earlier in the episode, is how quickly things went back to normal after the Stampede. Wowowee would go on to air for another 4 years until it was cancelled in 2010. Those who were already profiting from the show continued to profit from the show, and the audience continued to give their support because the proverbial cash prize carrot was still being dangled in front of them. All I hope now is that the court cases can soon provide some sort of relief and some sense of justice for those who chose not to settle and not to back down from the fight against the powers that be. Lagim fam, thank you again so much for listening to this episode. I know I promised a shorter one, but this case was not as simple as I first thought it would be. Again, do not forget to follow Lagim on all its social media platforms, especially Instagram, where I post updates and extra true crime content whenever I can. If you want to support the show, you can always head to the link in our Instagram bio and tap on the Buy Me Coffee link to make a one-off donation. Or you can become a patron on Lagim's Patreon page. At the moment, there is only one tier where you can get early access to episodes. I will definitely add more perks and tiers in the future, so definitely watch this space. And now to my podcast recommendation of the week. My podcast recommendation of the week is Pop Your Cultural Cherry, hosted by Filipino expat in Germany, Lawin. Here is his trailer.
Welcome to Pop Your Cultural Cherry. My name is Lawin and I am your host. In this podcast, we give you an outsider's perspective about European life, culture, and pretty much anything that is connected to this continent. So get ready to learn something new in a light and entertaining way.
Again, thank you so much for listening to this episode. If updates do come in about the case, I will make sure to let you know, as I already promised. Thank you again. Make sure to tune back in 2 weeks for a new episode, which will be our last episode of this season. Maraming salamat and mabuhay.